Sometimes it seems that certain names live in memory before we even have time to understand what they truly mean. Roswell is one of those names. It sounds familiar even to those who have never cared for the details. There's something instantly recognizable about it, like an old photograph you've seen many times but can't quite remember where from. Say the word, and images appear, ready-made. Night, desert, military base, debris, a sky where something extra seems to have happened. But this is where the strangeness begins. Because behind this name, people usually hide a legend, and the legend has long overshadowed what was first said in that very first moment. And the first moment is always especially important. In July 1947, the military in Roswell made a public statement. Debris of a flying disc had been found on a ranch. The wording was brief, almost dry, but it was enough for the story to instantly escape the bounds of ordinary news. It didn't sound like a cautious suggestion. There was a note of certainty in it. And in that second, when an official body calls what's been found an unknown flying object, reality itself seems to shift a little. Because from the government, we expect not fantasy but precision. Not wordplay, but restrained explanation. And if the military are the first to say such words, it means they either know more than they're saying, or they're speaking too soon. In either case, a pause arises, one that cannot be ignored. But then, something almost impossibly simple happens. Within a day, the messages change. That same flying disc disappears from the official version, replaced by a much more familiar explanation, a weather balloon. And all this happens not after months, not after years, not after a long investigation, but almost immediately. In a short stretch of time, the story goes from sensational admission to almost routine retraction. And it's this very turn that makes Roswell not just a famous episode, but a strange one. Because if this were only about an unusual find, it could be written off as a mistake, a rush to judgment, a misunderstanding. People make mistakes. Press releases too. But when first one official statement is given, and then it's almost immediately replaced by another, safer and far less impressive one, what arises is not an argument over details, but a quieter, deeper feeling. A sense that the story itself does not want to remain whole. Something was said too soon. Something was retracted too quickly. And between these two gestures, a crack appeared. Sometimes it's these very cracks that become more important than the event itself. Not because they prove the fantastic version, but because they show how easily the official story can change its shape, without explaining why it changed. On the outside, it looks like a simple correction. But inside, another feeling remains, as if we were shown only the first frame, and then the film was taken away. That's why Roswell is remembered not just as a story about debris in the desert. It's remembered as a moment when the news changed its own meaning before our eyes. First, a flying disc. Then, a weather balloon. First, a rare admission. Then, a quick return to the familiar explanation. And between them, silence remains, in which the question lingers almost wordless. What exactly made the story turn back so sharply? It's not necessary to answer this question right away. Sometimes it's enough just to notice that the turn happened, that it happened quickly, that it was official, and that after it, the name Roswell never sounded like just another place on the map. But to feel the scale of this strangeness, you need to return to a perfectly ordinary July day in 1947. There are things that look too mundane to immediately seem like part of a mystery. Dawn in New Mexico is not much different from dawn in any other dry, open place. A gray sky, the smell of earth, the dotted voices of sheep in the distance, a light wind barely stirring the grass on the pasture. Everything seems so familiar that the eye glides over the details without stopping. The summer of 1947 was an ordinary one. For the locals, for the rancher named Mac Brazel, the land was first and foremost a place to work, not a page in history, not a stage for unusual events. Here, days are measured by necessity. Check the pens, fix the fence, gather what broke overnight. Everything else seems external, distant, passing by. Even reports of strange lights in the sky, which people sometimes discuss in town, don't make much impression. But sometimes, in the very rhythm of ordinary tasks, something appears that's impossible to ignore. The morning started with a routine inspection of the pasture. Mac Brazel walked through the grass, sometimes bending down to pick up a tuft of wool dropped by a sheep, or to straighten a sagging wire. And suddenly, his gaze caught on something strange, a patch of earth strewn with debris. At first glance, it didn't look frightening. More puzzling. On the dry, cracked ground, among sparse shrubs and grass, lay many light, unusual fragments. Silvery strips, something like thin foil, pieces of material that wouldn't break in your hands, but almost bounced back, returning to their original shape. There were items that looked like burned beams, and small, seemingly melted bits in which nothing familiar could be seen. Something about this combination, the randomness of the placement, the number of fragments, their appearance, evoked in Brazel not fear, but quiet confusion. He wasn't given to speculation. What mattered to him was understanding what had happened to his pasture, and whether there was any danger to the animals. At first, he tried to gather some of the debris. Some fragments were so light they were almost carried away by the wind. Others, too strange to recognize right away, not wood, not metal, not plastic. When he tried to bend a thin silver strip, it bent, but then, as if with a memory of its own, returned to its original shape. Mac Brazel kept these finds, showed them to neighbors, but no one could say anything definite. For several days, the debris remained on the pasture, a reminder that in the familiar world, sometimes there appear details that don't fit into the usual pattern. There was talk. Could it be part of an airplane? A balloon? Someone suggested it was just trash brought by a recent storm. But none of the versions fit completely, none explained either the amount or the strange properties of the material. Gradually, as the news spread through the county, the story gathered details. Some thought they'd heard a dull sound at night. Someone recalled strange flashes on the horizon, but all of this stayed on the level of retelling. Brazel himself was not one to exaggerate. He described the find calmly, not demanding an explanation of wonders, but not downplaying the strangeness of what he'd seen. At some point, it became clear. The case was no longer private. Brazel contacted the local sheriff, and he, in turn, passed the information to the military. This was the threshold that separates a personal puzzle from an event into which other forces begin to be drawn. The landscape still remained the same: scorched grass, sheep, silence, and scattered debris on the ground. But now a new reality had been added: military interest, vehicles on the road, people in uniform arriving and beginning to work by their own rules, not always clear to outsiders. There is something almost cinematic in this moment, but without overt drama. Just a point where the ordinary flow of things is suddenly broken by something no one expected. Not a heavenly phenomenon, not a loud incident, but a material, tangible find demanding an explanation. It's important to remember. Before all the future versions, before the legends and arguments, before newspaper headlines and theories, there was this scene. A pasture in New Mexico. Sheep, the coolness of morning, and a man who found something he could not explain, to himself or to those around him. Sometimes it seems that mysteries arise not where they're expected, but where ordinary words simply end. That's why the story begins not with the sky, but with the earth, with a fact you can touch, but cannot immediately fit into common logic. And it's from this moment that an ordinary find quickly begins to turn into an event that can no longer be called private, and from here, everything starts to go beyond the limits of an isolated case. At first glance, everything starts routinely and almost formally. Summer of 1947, New Mexico, an ordinary military airfield receives a report of a strange find on Mac Brazel's ranch. By this time, the Army was used to odd reports. In recent weeks, a wave of flying disc sightings had swept the country, and each new case was considered more a nuisance or a public joke than something worthy of special attention. But this time, something entirely different happens. We rarely notice that sometimes the machinery of the state can be surprisingly direct. In a world where every word in an official announcement usually passes through dozens of filters and approvals, where it's more important not to say too much, not to give cause for unnecessary rumors, suddenly there appears a phrasing so simple and so provocative, it seems almost impossible. On July 8, 1947, the press office of the 509th Bomb Group of the U.S. Air Force releases a short statement. It says, in black and white, the Army has discovered and taken control of the wreckage of a flying disc. Not anonymous witnesses, not the yellow press, not random bystanders, but the military itself, with all the weight of official status and a habit of caution. It is they who first bring to light what will later become the central mystery of the entire story. The press release is simple. It's not adorned with details, doesn't speculate, offers no explanations. Just the fact: a flying disc has been found. The Army has recovered it. Details will be clarified. At this point, nothing is said about aliens, technology, or threat. Only a dry, almost impersonal transmission of information. But it is precisely this restraint, this unexpected directness, that makes the statement especially weighty. There is something vulnerably open in this gesture. The usual expectation is that the Army, faced with an anomaly, would try to keep silent, to avoid attention, to hide it from the public eye. But here, a complete reversal. An official admission that the object found falls outside ordinary explanation is fixed publicly, without any visible attempt to smooth over the situation. For a brief time, it seems that the state machine itself is ready to look the strange in the eye, not fleeing into explanations or hiding details in the archive. For people of that time, this moment becomes a real shock. Newspapers print the news on their front pages. Radio repeats the Army's wording. A quiet wave of discussion begins. The word disc, not scientific, not technical, but taken from the mouths of storytellers, suddenly becomes legitimized by the Army. And by inertia, it seems as if something very important is about to receive its explanation. As if the veil of mystery is about to be lifted. But here, it is important to catch another detail. The entire official structure, from senior officers to the press secretary, acts in concert. There is no panic, no rush, no fuss. The public gesture seems almost cold-blooded, but it is precisely this that creates a special tension. Because if it were something banal, would it have been necessary to bring it to the level of a military base press release? If the explanation was obvious, why not limit it to an internal instruction or a formal report? One can imagine how this moment looks in the silence of a military office. Paper on the table, a brief signature, a call to the newsroom, and suddenly, a new reality appears in the world, where the Army admits, yes, we have a flying disc. Just a few lines, but behind them opens an abyss of possibilities and questions to which no one hurries to give answers. But this remarkable state does not last long. Almost immediately, after a brief flash of public openness, a strange restraint begins to settle in the air. Military officials refuse to give further comments. The press is left in limbo. The official statement exists, but there are no details. Questions multiply, but answers do not follow. In that interval between the first admission and the silence that follows, a special, almost tangible pause arises. It resembles the feeling when someone in a room suddenly says something important, then immediately falls silent, offering neither meaning nor reason. And the further the story unfolds, the more it seems that this pause was no accident, but part of some greater inner script. Already then, in the first hours after the press release, two layers of reality begin to take shape. In one, an official statement, where the military machine unexpectedly acknowledges something inexplicable. In the other, a growing silence, in which a new version seems to ripen, ready to displace the first. This moment becomes the nerve of the entire Roswell story. Here, public reality suddenly starts to behave not as expected. Instead of closing the question, the Army only makes it louder, more mysterious. The fact does not become an answer, but the beginning of a new uncertainty. But within just a few hours, everything changes. The official version will be withdrawn. The words, flying disc, will vanish from Army messages, and in their place will arise a new, more mundane and safe story. And here, the story takes its main sharp turn, so swift that it itself becomes part of the mystery. There are things whose meaning changes too quickly and imperceptibly, as if someone flipped a switch, and a bright flash turns into ordinary daylight, which no one remembers. In the Roswell story, this moment came almost instantly. The official message about the discovery of a flying disc, which in the morning sounded like an invitation to a great mystery, had already been retracted by evening. In its place came another explanation, so prosaic that it is hard to imagine it as the main topic for the evening news. Weather balloon, a small, almost invisible object, designed to rise into the atmosphere and collect weather data. They are launched in many places around the world, and most often disappear without a trace, dissolving into daily routine. In this explanation, there was nothing that could attract the attention of thousands of people, newspapers, radio stations, military units. Yet it is this version that suddenly becomes the only acceptable one. In moments like this, it seems as if reality is trying to return to its old boundaries. As though someone is hastily closing a door that swung too wide. The explosion of interest, which just now was officially allowed, within a few hours turns into a misunderstanding. And no one offers explanations, they simply announce that everything turned out to be much simpler than it first appeared. This is not like an ordinary correction of a mistake. In everyday life, when new information appears, it is clarified, corrected, supplemented with details. Here, the change does not happen gradually, but as if by command. First, a loud statement that immediately becomes national news. Then, a sharp retreat, accompanied by almost mechanical repetition of the new version. As if the task is no longer to make sense of things, but simply to put everything back in its place. Almost unnoticed, we find ourselves trapped by contrast. On one side, a military base, press release, radio, newspapers, headlines promising something extraordinary. On the other, a simple explanation, so ordinary that its very appearance on the big screen seems strange. Why does a story that could have faded among countless others suddenly become the focus of such high attention? Why does its retraction require not just a brief clarification, but a full public announcement that sounds as if it should close the matter for good? Perhaps the strangest question is hidden within the most familiar. If only a weather balloon was found, why was there an announcement of a flying disc in the first place? Why not resolve the details quietly, without loud words? Why did the military, so accustomed to secrecy and precision of language, allow such an open and almost theatrical mistake, and then just as theatrically withdraw it? There is something subtly unnatural in this movement, as if the whole story was too brief a flash, followed immediately by darkness. For those who watched the events in real time, the changing versions were not just disappointing, but something more. As if someone showed a map marking an unknown place, and a day later took the map away and declared that nothing had ever been there. One can imagine what this looked like for an ordinary person. In the morning, an impression that the familiar world had suddenly opened to something entirely new. Newspapers sell out in hours, the radio repeats the same news, neighbors discuss it in shops and at gas stations. But by the next day, everything returns to the old silence, and the only thing left is a sense that the boundary between possible and impossible had become just a little less certain. The weather balloon as an image, is almost a symbol of the everyday, of technical routine, of something that exists outside of any mystery. Its simplicity only underscores the strangeness of the whole story. If it were truly something secret, perhaps the explanation would be more complex, more tangled, requiring new levels of clearance. But here, the opposite. An object so mundane becomes the only permitted answer to a statement that was too loud. Sometimes such a swift closure brings not clarity, but a new shadow. The simpler and more confident the explanation sounds, the more noticeable it becomes how much remains unspoken. Changing the version does not remove the questions, but only makes them less convenient to discuss. And in this, a special silence, where there is neither scandal, nor comfort, nor a true ending. The memory of such events usually does not vanish, but freezes on the border between the official and the unofficial. The story begins to live its own life. Some repeat the new version, others recall the first, still others look for hints at what happened between them. And all this, against the backdrop of an explanation that itself seems too small for the wave it raised. There are moments when a simple word can become a symbol. Weather balloon, an absurdly quiet answer to a question asked too loudly. The uncertainty is not that someone is hiding something, but that even with no obvious secrets, the very sequence of actions already gives a sense of incompleteness. Perhaps that is why the Roswell story does not die. It requires neither belief nor refutation. It simply reminds us how easily meaning shifts when someone decides the old answer has become inconvenient. And the calmer the new answer sounds, the more it is clear that it does not close all the questions, and the softer the new version, the louder the silence of what remains unexplained. There are things that insist too strongly on being ordinary. By that insistence, we sometimes recognize that what we face is not mere accident, but something that demands much more effort to appear normal. It happens with gestures, with stories, with explanations repeated over and over, as if trying to convince not so much others as oneself. The Roswell story is one of these. At the level of official documents, everything appears almost routine. An unidentified object is found, an alarm is raised, the military quickly take control, and then just as quickly announce a simple, technical explanation. Weather balloon. Torn fragments, foil, wood, rubber. No mysterious technologies, no aliens, nothing beyond a typical military day. But if you slow down and look closely at the sequence of events, a strange disproportion begins to appear between what is told and how it is told. Between the object and the reaction to it. A picture arises. A military officer sitting at a table, strange debris laid out before him. Photographers catch every gesture, flashes light up the room, faces are tense, even though, it would seem, everything is clarified. In the officer's hands, neither myth nor fantasy, but those very pieces of rubber, paper, foil, officially declared parts of a weather balloon. And yet, in this frame, there is no sense of relief. On the contrary, a strange tension, as if the scene itself does not match its explanation. We rarely pay attention to such mismatches because we are used to trusting the flow of events. If the institution, the army, the state, the press office, says the object on the table is ordinary, we instinctively apply that explanation to our own feelings and try not to linger too long on the details. But sometimes, the details stubbornly refuse to fit the picture. Why, if everything is so simple, were so many people needed, so many urgent calls, so many closed offices? Why was the reaction so immediate and strict? Why did a small patch of New Mexico suddenly fall into almost laboratory silence, full of military jeeps and whispers, as if it were something far more serious than the remains of a weather balloon? Perhaps the issue is not with the object itself, but with the context. 1947. The peak of military anxiety, the start of the Cold War, a time when uncertainty was felt as a threat. Any anomaly, anything that did not fit the usual frame, instantly became an object of control, censorship, analysis. Yet even with this in mind, there is something excessive in the military's behavior. Too fast a change of version, too carefully chosen rhetoric, too much attention to what is officially of no interest. Perhaps the strangest question is hidden in the most familiar. If it really was a weather balloon, why does its story outlive any other episode involving fallen technology? Why does the explanation not close the question, but only fuel a new wave of reflection, suspicion, guesses? Perhaps it is not about the details themselves, but about how they were presented. The image of the officer with the debris is not just illustration. It is a symbol of the moment when reality is shaped not only by those who experience it, but by those who frame it. The object ends up in the hands of the state, but clarity does not increase. On the contrary, it is at this moment that the split begins between the official and the unofficial story, between what the eyes see and what is allowed to be called by name. There is a strange pattern. The simpler the explanation, the harder it is to trust if it is accompanied by a massive reaction that does not match the subject. Perhaps that is the main reason Roswell is not forgotten, even decades later. It did not become a legend because it was too mysterious, but because its explanation was too simple against a background of behavior that was too complex. When the military declares a find classified, when journalists are only admitted to a press conference after careful filtering, when debris is transported first to one base, then immediately to another, all this forms a pattern that resists ordinary logic. Ordinary things do not provoke such measures. Ordinary things do not require press releases to be rewritten in an instant. Ordinary things do not become the cause of total silence for years to come. It is this disproportionality that becomes the main source of distrust in the official version. Not because one wants to believe in a fairy tale, but because so much effort was spent making the unusual appear normal, and so little time was left for real questions. Perhaps this is the main mystery of Roswell. Not in the debris, not in the legends, not in conspiracy theories, but in how the state can rewrite reality in a day, then require everyone to live in a new version that sounds too smooth to be final. We stand at the threshold of this story as on a boundary between light and shadow. On one side, an explanation repeated hundreds of times. On the other, behavior that does not match that explanation. And between them, a pause, in which nothing is heard but your own breath. There are things that happen so quietly, you want not to notice them. Sometimes silence is simply the absence of words, sometimes, a layer that covers an event more densely than paper or concrete. In the Roswell story, the pause between the first noise and the subsequent explanations became almost an actor in its own right. We rarely notice that the true mystery arises not from what someone says, but from when and why someone says nothing at all. Officials, witnesses, the military, all those who found themselves at the very center of events, seem to vanish into shadow after the first few days. Their names flicker in newspapers, but the details never appear. Almost no one makes public statements. There are no direct interviews, no spontaneous stories, not even leaks that usually accompany sensational events. Perhaps the strangest question hides in the most familiar place. Why do those who held the fragments in their hands, who saw the command's reaction and took part in transporting the find, why do they hardly speak of it for years? And why, when memories emerge decades later, do they not sound like eyewitness testimony, but more like an attempt to grasp something elusive within their own minds? In the first months after the incident, silence might be explained by military discipline. An order, and everything found in the pasture becomes a subject for internal discussion, but not for the public. But the silence drags on. Years pass, and none of those who could clarify anything return to this topic. Even in private conversation, almost nothing. As if the story is buried so deeply that even their own memory obeys the order. The silence felt by the outside observer begins to seem dense and heavy, not like emptiness, but like a fabric one can get caught in. Beyond the borders of official versions, nothing is spoken, but this silence brings no peace. On the contrary, the longer nothing is added, the louder the absence itself sounds. Time makes the pause no less important than the events that came before it. And then, suddenly, 3 decades later, a voice appears, as if emerging from this prolonged silence. Jesse Marcel, the very officer who was first on the scene and accompanied the debris to the military base, agrees to an interview in the late 1970s. His words do not resemble a sensation. There is no cry, no accusation. There is caution and a strange blend of embarrassment and certainty. He recalls details that do not fit a simple explanation of a weather balloon. He speaks of the unusual nature of the materials, of the command's reaction, of how quickly and sharply the narrative changed. And, above all, he admits, everything that was found did not resemble what he or his colleagues had ever seen before. Yet almost 30 years pass between that day in 1947 and the moment Marcel first speaks openly. Much changes in that time. Memory grows less clear, nuances fade, emotions take on new shapes. Every question posed to him inevitably touches not only on facts, but also on why he remained silent for so long. Marcel's answers are quiet: orders, fear, respect for the structure, but none of this fully explains the pause. There is a sense that the real reason for the silence lies deeper than discipline alone. When later testimony appears where there was only silence for so long, it does not so much reveal details as make the pause itself more tangible. Each of Marcel's words seems to cast a shadow over the space between past and present. We do not hear new facts, but begin to hear the silence itself, as if the empty space between events has started to speak. Perhaps this pause is the main mystery. For if an event is fully explained, if all participants freely and immediately share their experiences, the room for doubt narrows quickly. But when a long silence lies between the fact and its understanding, it feels as though something greater is hidden in that silence than in any document. The psychological effect of delay is not that a late admission immediately turns history upside down. Rather, the pause itself becomes part of the narrative. The longer no one speaks, the more meaning we seek in every word that follows. Imagination does not work on the details, but on the gaps between them. Silence becomes a space for questions that cannot be asked directly. And there is something deeply human in this. Faced with a situation where it's unclear what one is allowed to say and what must remain unsaid, a person instinctively chooses silence, even as tension builds within it. Sometimes that silence is a gesture of protection. Sometimes it is an expression of confusion or the inability to find words. But as years pass, it stops being just a personal choice and becomes part of history itself. The silence of the Roswell participants does not dispel doubt, it gives it new weight. For we do not know what remains unspoken, out of fear, out of loyalty, out of that ordinary human desire not to be drawn into a conversation that is too complex. Yet it is this absence of voices that turns the story into a space where what is not said rings louder than what is already known. Perhaps the answers will remain between the lines, or dissolve in that very pause that became the central note of the whole story. But if new information ever emerges, it will inevitably be interpreted through the lens of this drawn-out silence. Because, strangely enough, it is the silence that has proven to be the strongest link in the chain. But after decades, the story gains another layer, not of memories, but of documents. There are things that appear in history too late to change its course, but just in time to change how it is perceived. The declassified Roswell documents are just such a case. Not a revelation, not a final point, but a paper trail that appears so many years later that its very arrival becomes part of the mystery. In 1994, when American society had long lived with the shadow of the unresolved Roswell question, the government released new materials in response to requests made under the Freedom of Information Act. This is not a sensational archive, not a folder stamped, top secret, containing a photograph of the debris or an admission of extraterrestrial life. These are reports, memos, internal investigations and explanations, carefully collected, edited, and characteristically dry. But even in their documentary restraint, these papers do not dampen interest. On the contrary, they make it denser, deeper. Because when new official explanations appear almost half a century after the event, the question arises: why were they not presented immediately? Why is a new layer now added? A layer of paper interpretations that ought to explain everything, but instead create the sense of a belated commentary on a rupture that has already occurred? In these documents, it is described in detail.